Hey everybody, this is chapter 9 of Marx Labor Working Class by Tronti. Chapter 9 is titled Labor as Non-Capital. It was Marx who spoke of the Angriffskraft, attacking power, of the working class, and of the Widerstandskraft, power of resilience of capital. We need to put these terms back into circulation in today's struggle, for within them is contained that strategic overturn that has only been attempted once in practice after Marx, and which after Lenin was stashed away in both theory and practice. If we want to demonstrate how this overturn can function once more, that is, in forms of struggle, we need to carry further the process of reconstructing the objective movements of the forces that find themselves in struggle. In the meantime, we have conquered one point that some people are even ready to admit in principle, but which no one is ready to consider for all its weight of consequences, namely, that first, there exists the poor free laborer, and thus the proletariat as the, quote, party of destruction, end quote. Then there develops the commodity labor power, and thus the single worker as a producer in potential. And finally comes the social forces of productive labor in Act 2, and thus the working class in the process of production. These are in turn, conceptually and historically speaking, begrifflich und geschichtlich, the true and proper dynamic elements of capital, the primary cause of capitalist development. In this sense, Arbeitskraft is not only a commodity object that passes from the worker's hands into the hands of capital. Rather, it is an active force that all the more passes from the working class to the class of capitalists, the more that it precedes development. Marx's eulogy to the powerful and incessant activity of the bourgeoisie would correctly be redirected toward the proletarian threat that was snapping at its heels. The charge of ever-agitated dynamism that seems to push capital forth in each moment of capital's history is in reality the aggressive thrust of class movements pushing within capitalism. Within capital. Schumpeter portrays the figure of the entrepreneur with the entrepreneur's innovating initiative. It is pleasing for us to see this figure turned inside out, as the permanent initiative and struggle of the great masses of the working class. Through this passage, Arbeitskraft can and must become Angriffskraft. This is the passage, this time, a political one, from labor power to the working class. Marx shows his greatest awareness of this problem in the Grundrisse, and perhaps this is simply due to form, here obliged neither to arrange his arguments in an ironclad logical order, nor to take any particular care for language in expounding them, in a phase of research that was wholly his own, that is, in a work that stood far from publication. Marx here made a more expeditious advance in his fundamental discoveries, and thus discovered more and more new things that did not appear in his finished works, starting with contribution to the critique of political economy and volume 1 of Capital. It follows from this that politically the Grundrisse, the internal monologue that Marx built up with himself in Marx's own time, turns out to be a more advanced book than the other two, for it is a text that leads more directly through thrown together practical pages to a new type of political conclusion. Look, for example, how before arriving at the concept of living labor, and thus before Marx gets stuck in the original exchange relation between capital and labor, Marx poses the problem, quote, was ist unter, quote, Gesellschaft, end quote, zu verstehen, unquote. Quote, nothing is more erroneous than the way in which both the economist and the socialist consider society in relation to economic conditions. End quote. Proudhon saw no difference for society between capital and the product. But does the difference between capital and the product not lie in the fact that as capital, the product expresses a determinate relation relative to a historical form of society? Quote, this so-called consideration from the point of view of society means nothing more than to overlook precisely the differences which express the social relation of civil society. Society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of the relationships and conditions in which these individuals stand to one another, end quote. Marx. So I don't know if I've said the first quote. Let me repeat that. Quote, this so-called consideration from the point of view of society means nothing more than to overlook precisely the differences which express the social relation of civil society. Society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of the relationships and conditions in which these individuals stand to one another, end quote. Marx. This definition of society is important precisely for the purposes of defining the social substance common to all commodities as if they were single individuals. This common substance can no longer be their singular material content, their individual physical determinations. It must be the fact that their form, indeed a social form, is the product of a social relation. But it is possible to speak of this form, insofar as it is value, insofar as it is a determinate quantity of labor, only by looking for an antithesis to capital. And what constitutes the common substance of all commodities is the fact that, socially, commodities are all objectified labor, but, quote, the only thing distinct from objectified labor is non-objectified labor, labor still objectifying labor's self, labor as subjectivity, or objectified labor, i.e. labor present in space, can also be opposed as past labor to labor still present in time. If it is to be present in time, present alive, it can only be present as a living subject, in which it exists as capacity, as potentiality, therefore as worker, end quote. Marx. We have already seen that in the text to the contribution to the critique of political economy from the same period as the Grundrisse, Marx would draw the even more concise synthesis that, quote, the only opposite of reified labor is unreified labor, and the opposite of objectified labor, subjective labor, end quote. Marx. Subjective labor counterposed to objectified labor, living labor counterposed to dead labor, is labor counterposed to capital, labor is non-capital. Die Arbeit als das Nicht-Kapital. It has two fundamental characteristics, both of which mark labor as a non-something, a nicht, which I think is like not, or an im, or a no. No, nicht means not. Planted in the heart of a network of positive social relations, which entails the possibility of both their development and their destruction. As the Grundrisse puts it, quote, labor as non-capital, posited as such, is one, not objectified labor, negatively conceived, itself still objective, the not object itself an objective, bracket, objectiver, and bracket form. As such, it is non-raw material, non-instrument of labor, non-raw product, labor separated from all means of labor and all objects of labor from its whole objectivity, bracket, objectivitet, in bracket. Living labor existing as abstraction from these moments of its actual reality, likewise non-value, this complete denudation, the purely subjective existence of labor lacking all objectivity, bracket, objectivitet, end bracket, labor as absolute poverty, poverty not as shortage but as a complete exclusion of objective wealth, or also as the existing non-value and hence purely objective use value, existing without mediation. This objectivity can only be one not separated from the person, only one coincident with his immediate corporality. Since the objectivity is purely immediate, it is also immediately non-objectivity. In other words, not an objectivity falling outside the immediate existence of the individual himself. 2. Not objectified labor, non-value, positively conceived, or negativity relating itself to itself. As such, it is not objectified, therefore non-objective, i.e. subjective existence of labor itself. Labor not as object, but as activity, not as itself value, but as the living source of value. General wealth in contrast to capital, in which wealth exists objectively as reality, general wealth as its general possibility, which possibility proves itself as such in activity, end quote. Marx. There is therefore absolutely no contradiction, Marx continues, in labor being, quote, on the one hand absolute poverty as such, and on the other the general possibility of wealth as subject and activity, end quote. Marx. Better, it is wholly contradictory, but precisely due to the fact that labor itself is a contradiction of capital, and even before that a contradiction for itself. Abstract labor has a use value, or rather labor pure and simple, parenthesis, schlechten, is pure and simple use value that stands counterposed to capital. It is labor as worker, quote, absolutely indifferent of its particular determination, end quote, and yet, quote, capable of any determination, end quote. The interest of the worker is always for labor in general, and never for its determinate character. Each character is, in fact, only use value for capital. For this very reason, since labor is as such only in opposition to capital, the worker is thus only in opposition to the capitalist. Quote, this economic relation, the character which capitalist and worker bears the extremes of a relation of production, is therefore developed the more purely and adequately. The more labor loses all craft-like character, the more labor's particular skill becomes something abstract, irrelevant, and the more it becomes purely abstract, purely mechanical activity, hence irrelevant, indifferent to its particular form, the more it becomes merely formal activity, or what is the same, merely physical, bracket, stoffliche, and bracket activity. Activity pure and simple, indifferent to its form, end quote. Marx. Arbeitsprozess in das Kapital aufgenommen. Quote, by the exchange with the worker, capital has appropriated labor itself, which has become one of the moments of capital, and which now acts as a fructifying vitality upon its merely present and hence dead objectivity, end quote. Marx. Capital, at this point, cannot continue passively to identify capital's self with objectified labor, parenthesis, that is, as money, end parenthesis. Rather, capital must establish an active relationship as capital with living labor, with, quote, labor existing as process and action, end quote. This indeed is the qualitative difference between the substance and the form in which it also exists as labor. It is the process of this distinction, bracket, Unterscheidung, in bracket, and of its overcoming, bracket, Aufhebung, in bracket, the path through which, quote, capital itself becomes process, end quote. Marx. Quote, labor is the yeast thrown into capital, bringing capital now into fermentation, bracket, Zergürung, end bracket. On the other hand, the objectivity in which capital exists must be processed, i.e. consumed by labor. On the other hand, the mere subjectivity of labor as pure form must be transcended, bracket, aufgehoben, end bracket, and it must be objectified in the material of capital. The relation of capital in accordance with its content to labor, of objectified labor to living labor, in this relation where capital appears as passive towards labor, it is its passive being as a particular substance that enters into relation with labor as creative activity, can in general only be the relation of labor to its objectivity, its physical matter, bracket, Stoff, end bracket, parenthesis, which must be dealt with already in the first chapter, which must precede that on exchange value and must treat of production in general, end parenthesis. And with regard to labor as activity, the physical matter, the objectified labor, has only two relations, that of raw material, i.e. of the formless physical matter, of mere material for the form-giving, purposive activity of labor, and that of the instrument of labor, of the means, its objective, by which the subjective activity inserts an object as its conductor, bracket, Leiter, and bracket, between itself and the object, end quote. Marx. Produktionsprozess als Inhalt des Kapitals. Quote, in the first act, in the exchange between capital and labor, labor as such, existing for labor's self, necessarily appears as the worker. Similarly, here in the second process, capital in general is posited as value existing for value's self, as egotistic value, so to speak, something which was only aspired to in money. But capital existing for capital's self is the capitalist. Of course, socialists say we need capital but not the capitalist. Capital then appears as a pure thing, not as relationship of production, which reflected in itself is precisely the capitalist. I can indeed separate capital from this individual capitalist, and capital can pass on to another capitalist. But when the capitalist loses his capital, the capitalist loses the quality of being a capitalist. Capital is therefore quite separable from an individual capitalist, but not from the capitalist who as such confronts the worker. In the same way, the individual worker can cease to be the being for itself of labor. The individual worker can inherit money, steal, etc., but then he ceases to be a worker, end quote. Marx. Quote, by the incorporation of labor into the quote, by the incorporation of labor into capital, capital becomes process of production, but initially material process of production in general, so the process of production of capital is not distinct from the material process of production in general. The process of production of capital's determinateness of form is completely extinguished. Since capital has exchanged a part of capital's objective being, bracket, Sein, end bracket, for labor, that objective being, bracket, Dasein, end bracket, itself is internally divided, bracket, derimiert in sich, end bracket, into object and labor. The relation of the two constitutes the process of production, or more precisely the labor process. Thus the labor process, posited as point of departure before value, a process which, because of its abstractness, this process is pure materiality, is equally common to all forms of production, here reappears again within capital as a process which proceeds within capital's physical matter, forms capital's content, end quote. I might have misread that last sentence. I'm going to read it again. Thus the labor process, posited as point of departure before value, a process which, because of that process's abstractness, that process's pure materiality, is equally common to all forms of production, here reappears again within capital as a process which proceeds within its physical matter, forms its content. End quote. Marx. Surplus Arbeitszeit. Quote, if a working day were required in order to keep a worker alive for a working day, capital would not exist because one could not because one working day would exchange for one working day's own product. As a result, capital could not valorize capital's self as capital, and thus could not preserve capital's self. The self-preservation of capital is capital's self-valorization. If capital had to work in order to live, capital would not preserve capital's self as capital, but as labor, end quote. Marx. But, quote, if the worker requires only half a working day to live for a whole day, the worker needs to work only half a day to eke out his existence as a worker. The second half of the working day is forced labor, surplus labor. What appears on the side of capital as surplus value appears on the worker's side precisely as surplus labor, over and above the worker's requirements as a worker, hence over and above the worker's immediate requirements to sustain his vitality. End quote. Marx. In this sense, a complete historical determination of capital presupposes one, needs so developed that surplus labor beyond the necessary level itself becomes a general need. 2. A general industriousness which, through the rigorous discipline of capital, develops into a general possession. 3. Such a mature development of the productive forces of labor that the possession and conservation of the general wealth, quote, requires from the whole of society only comparatively little labor time on the one hand, quote, and on the other hand, laboring society takes a scientific attitude towards the process of laboring society's continuing reproduction, laboring society's reproduction in ever greater abundance, so that labor in which man does what he can make things do for him has ceased, end quote. Marx. Quote, as the ceaseless striving, bracket, Ratslose Streben, end bracket, for the general reform of wealth, however, capital forces labor beyond the limits of natural need and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is as varied and comprehensive, allseitig, in its production as it is in its consumption, and whose labor therefore no longer appears as labor, but as the full development of activity itself, in which natural necessity has disappeared in natural necessity's immediate form, because natural need has been replaced by historically produced, geschichtlich erzeugte need. This is why capital is productive, i.e. an essential relationship for the development of the productive forces of society. Capital ceases to be such only where the development of these productive forces themselves encounters a barrier in capital itself, end quote. Marx. This is the new path that Marx himself here proposes. The starting point, labor as non-capital, and thus labor as the living subject of the worker, as against the dead objectivity of all the other conditions of production. Labor as the vital ferment of capital, another act of determination added to the activity of productive labor. The point of arrival, capital, which itself becomes productive, an essential relation to the development of labor as a social productive power, and thus an essential relation to the development of the working class, a new function of capital that now makes it serve the worker. Along this path, between these 2 points, is labor as non-value, and for this very reason, a living source of value, absolute misery, and for this very reason, the general possibility of wealth, again, surplus labor, and for this very reason, surplus value. The modern figure of the collective worker that now comes to produce capital precisely as an antagonistic class that combats it. This is the decisive point that now needs bringing into focus. The production process, the act of producing capital, is contemporaneously the moment of the working class struggle against capital, the specific moment to which all the other generic levels of the struggle are compelled to refer in order themselves to become productive. In the act of production, the relation of productive force between the 2 classes is favorable to the working class side. Let's ask why that is. Well, we have seen already, for labor power to pass into the capitalist relation of production is a need of capital's. It's capital's need. Indeed, capital needs it to do so no longer only as a social productive power objectified in capital, but as the living active subject of the worker, thus associated and thus objectified. Upon the act of purchase and sale in the market, labor power distinguishes itself with 2 fundamental characteristics. 1, that of being already in substance counterposed to capital, and 2, that of being still formally autonomous of capital. Its autonomy, the charter of its rights on which the word, quote, freedom is written in Gothic letters, consists of the fact that it is still outside of the capitalist relation of production. The moment of exchange is not only the realm of freedom, because the buyer and seller deal as free individuals, but because capital and labor here present themselves, at least formally, as free of each other. It is this freedom that they must lose if they want to live. This is the sense in which Marx sees, in the passage to production, the dissolution of capital as a, quote, formal relation, end quote. What in fact falls away here is precisely the form of the reciprocal autonomy between the moments of the relation, and what remains is the relation itself in its substance, in its raw and immediate reality, without the mediation of formal expression, we would say without ideology. But the substance of the relation is given from the outset by the antithetical counterposition between labor and potential and capital in itself, the simple figures of labor and capital, of worker and capitalist. The content of the capitalist relation is, in each moment, the class relation, and the class relation sees the initiative in struggle on the working class side as the initial point in the process, the permanent motor of this process, the absolute negation of capital as such, and at the same time the dynamic articulation of the capitalist interest. In the passage to production, this class content of capital as a, quote, substantial relation, end quote, is not only conserved in substance, not only liberated from the form, but is and must be specifically socialized and objectified. It must be socialized in the sense that the single individual labor powers must become a social productive power or a social power of productive labor, it must be objectified in the sense that this social power of productive labor must become a social productive power for capital. These two processes, the socialization of labor power and labor power's objectification in capital, are gripped within a single necessity, namely the need to break the autonomy of labor power without destroying its antagonistic character. Capital's existence, capital's birth, capital's development are not all links in the presence of this antagonism. Not only can capital not exist without labor power, capital cannot exist without the socialization of labor power. Not only can capital not do without the working class, but capital cannot do without introducing the working class itself within capital as capital's own living part. The process of capitalist socialization can proceed very far. It has possibilities for development that seem unlimited. It leaps backward from the production relation to the exchange relation and forward toward the relations of distribution. It takes hold of the general social relation and continually pushes it up a degree, a level, a moment. And yet there is a marked limit to this which it is able to surpass. The process of general socialization cannot go so far as to liquidate the workers as a specific class. It cannot, it must not dilute, dissolve, dismember the working class amid the whole of society. It can and must increasingly socialize the class relation, such as it is, and ever renew the workers as an antagonistic class within it. On the capitalist side, this is the road to social control over the movements of the working class. On the working class side, this is the perspective of ultimately political growth of its own, counter to the insuperable limit that capital places on capital's self. Thus, the process of the objectification of each social relation within capital carries with it a historic charge that accumulates as it advances. This builds up an irresistible force, from commodity fetishism to capital fetishism, by way of a whole era of positive violence. The reduction of everything that is socially alive to something dead seems practically complete. Yet here, too, an insurmountable barrier impedes the completion of this operation. The process of total objectification cannot go so far as to liquidate the individual life of labor as active subject, cannot and must not reduce to passive dead objectivity the same vital ferment that sets everything into activity through production. The more that there grows and advances the objectification in capital of all that is social, the more the activity, the initiative, the quote entrepreneurial and quote interest of the working class must advance and grow within capital. On the capitalist side, this conditions the system's rational economic development. Whereas on the working class side, it is the opportunity to politically subordinate capital's movements to itself. The initial class content is thus revealed to be ever more present and ever more determinate in the capitalist relation of production, its substance life-giving precisely because it is its immanent contradiction, precisely because it is a continual striving on the working class side to make political subjective use of an objective economic mechanism. The socialization and objectification process augments these possibilities of its alternative use, which are, moreover, implicit in every capitalist production process. From capital's practical point of view, there is no choice other than to guide these processes by making the working class carry these processes forward. The working class practical point of view can choose to carry them forward while also refusing capital's direction. It thus enjoys a position of potential advantage. It needs only that this working class choice not be left up to spontaneity, that it finds the way to express itself in a powerful subjective organization, and that the relation of forces is effectively overturned. Within the workers attacking power, with the workers, where the fuck am I? With the workers attacking power, pushing the capitalist resistance into a defensive position. In the factory and production, when the workers serve the capitalists as the machines do capital, but moreover have the possibility of choosing not to serve him, and when labor is within capital, and at the same time against capital, then the collective boss is enormously weak, for he has left for a moment the arms with which he was fighting. The productive forces of labor, socialized and objectified in the working class, in the hands of his enemies. If labor's activities should cease, then capital's life also ceases. A closed factory is already dead labor, capital at rest that does not produce and does not reproduce itself. The strike is not by chance a permanent form of working class struggle, and thus working class struggle's primitive form, which develops but without ever negating itself. And the recognition of this basic fact has the vast power that simple things sometimes do, since the strike is a cessation of activity by living labor, which is to say, living labor's reduction to dead labor. Labor's refusal to work. Living labor's refusal to be work. The strike is thus the collapse of the distinction, the separation, the counterposition between labor and capital. And this is the most terrible threat that can be wielded against the very life of capitalist society. Living labor's refusal of activity is the recovery of living labor's autonomy, which is to say precisely autonomy that the production process has to break. And this is the other thing that capital cannot withstand. Capital must keep labor distinct from capital's self and counterposed to capital's self as an economic potential, yet at the same time subordinate labor to capital's own command as political potential. Capital must, that is, counterpose itself to labor power without leaving the working class autonomous. Capital must conceive labor power itself as a working class. But within the capitalist relation of production, it must therefore conserve, reproduce, and extend the class relation while also controlling the class relation. And this is the thread that links together capital's modern history. Today, the strategy of the working class revolution is to break the thread of this control at some point. To this day, the starting point in the struggle is a separate political autonomy of the two sides, class movements. Hence, once more, all the problems of organization are on the working class side. Capital strives to shut off the moment of antagonism within the class relation. Within the economic relation. Incorporating the class relation into the capitalist relation as its social object. Opposite to this, the effort on the working class side must be to continually try to smash open this economic form of the antagonism. It must have as its day-to-day objective the restoration of political content to each elementary moment of confrontation. It must thus make the capitalist relation work subjectively within the class relation, conceiving capital as a production relation always and only as a moment of the working class's struggle. This is the route through which labor's living activity, socialized by capital and objectified in capital, can be made roughly to serve the work of positive destruction that the working class viewpoint materially entails. This fermenting vitality of working class labor is, in fact, still nothing more than an antagonism, and the antagonism is nothing other than its antithetical character, its position of permanent negation, this continually repeated no, this rejection of everything which, when left up to spontaneity, whips the capitalist and makes the capitalist run and forces the capitalist to repeat himself, as Marx said, onward, this, which when channeled between the iron limits of revolutionary organization, first sets up the economic barrier of capital before itself like a dam, and then politically besieges, overwhelms, and destroys it. We start out from this presupposition that capital has now arrived at retracing the natural law of capital's own social development. In these conditions, the ultimate end of working class thought is no longer to reveal capitalist society's economic law of motion. At this point, every phase of capitalism's unfolding ought to be at once reduced to a practical means of its possible dissolution. It ought to be shown how capital's laws of development are laws of the capitalist development of the working class as the organization of the workers by the capitalists. There is a fetishism of labor power that attaches itself to the producers of capital as soon as they begin to produce social capital. What first of all needs doing is to violently suppress this modern bourgeois semblance, which subordinates labor to capital, and to do so in struggle. It is in with such action that we will find the decisive political terrain for defeating the capitalists. And what then needs doing on this basis is to set off in discovery of the working class's political laws of movement, which materially subordinate the development of capital to the working class itself. Thus will be found the definitive theoretical mask from the working class point of view. From this point onward, capitalism must begin to interest us only as a historical system of the reproduction of the working class. And that's the end of chapter 9 of Mario Tronti's Marx, Labor, Power, Working Class. Chapter 9 was titled Labor as Non-Capital. Thank you so much for listening.